Welcome to Secure Talk, a podcast for security news, innovation, and excellence. Secure Talk is hosted by Justin Beals, founder and CEO of StrikeGraph. Justin has a 20-year career in technology, innovation, and startups.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Secure Talk. Really glad to have you today. We have a very special guest, really good friend of mine, who I've had the pleasure of collaborating with a fair bit, Mark Listis, who is the CEO and founder of Pendulum. Mark, thanks for joining the podcast today.
Hey, Justin. Thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure and it's an honor.
Excellent. This is going to be a really amazing conversation. Pendulum is an incredibly unique technology on the marketplace. Mark has an incredible story about not just security, but also how we operate as a society. And it's something that I find deeply engaging beyond even our concepts around security and cybersecurity, but even into how we want to operate as a society and the communities we want to build. So, Mark, let's kind of start at the beginning for you. It's a place where we like to begin with all of our guests. Let's talk a little bit about any early influences, even pre-college. What were you excited about? What were you kind of interested in moving into an academic career?
Oh, man. You're going to make me go all the way back, Justin.
We start in the beginning here. That's right.
I think at a young age, I was somebody who was obsessed with the development that was possible through technology. I mean, I think I was a self-taught coder when I was very young and started to work in things like Visual Basic back in the day and really started to build it. But I think that first moment that you do the compiling of the code base and see something actually work was the moment that sparked for me, oh my gosh, you can really build and create net new things all within this technical world. And that started when I was pretty young. And I think that led to kind of a very IC individual contributor mentality for a while. I loved to build, became simultaneously kind of got a little bit of an obsession with philosophy and the world around us and kind of the ability for macro and micro forces to affect individuals and groups at large. So led through a political science degree, almost a business degree at one point in time, law school as it went through, and then has actually kind of provided this basis for IC to being forced into management roles, to using tech to build things even bigger. And I think it started really young. I was 12 or 13 or something when I started coding and became really diving into the philosophy world right around the same age. And I'm proud to say that I still do a little bit of both, although I think my engineers will say that happily I don't do a lot of the first one of coding anymore. And it's been a fun journey, but yeah, I think it all started then.
Yeah, I'm not allowed to touch the code anymore as much as I want to. But I do remember a day when I was working at British Telecom where I realized that I had the key card to the data center and the president of the division did not. And I was like, oh, this is very intriguing. Who gets access and who doesn't? So yeah, it's also an interesting thread. I think there is this power and strength in realizing the scale of technology and engineering. I caught the same bug around computationally, what you could build, what you could program. But then I think a desire to engage the world more broadly, the community. Sometimes those things have to come together, right? You realize the impact you're going to have in writing this particular code.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think that there's a real maturity that we see in the tech space here that is the full cycle awareness of a singular line of code, the effect it has on an end user. And I think that tech is one of the only places where you can actually see that full cycle go through, change part of somebody's life on a day-to-day basis and feel that impact from the moment that you hit enter on that last kind of line on the code or that adjustment there is there. And I think it leads to really great things like the ability to really have customer obsession all the way through an organization and a company because you can feel and see that impact. At the same time, I think it's worth highlighting that it's unique to this space, right? Like there's so many ways. I mean, I grew up in a family whose grandfather sprayed insulation in buildings for people that he never got to see the effect on their life on. And it's so special to have that loop be very, very close.
Yeah, absolutely. And then your academic career, you studied political science and then law, right?
Yes. Yeah. Political science. I think I'm like somewhere in there, a couple of credits short of a business degree. And then somehow got convinced myself that I should go to law school. I had like started and built a think tank for a while, and that led to me going to law school. And then I ended up in law school and was a full-time law student, I think, for about 6 weeks. And then I started a company.
The early entrepreneurial bug, huh? Yeah.
Yes. I like to describe it that I was the most dedicated, passionate law student you had until month 2, and then became the most distracted law student anybody ever had in their class.
Well, no one asked about your GPA once you're out of college, I've realized. Yes, thank goodness. But it is like an interesting tool set. I think of law as like the engineering code of, the framework of our society in a way.
Yeah, I think that that's right. I mean, I think that one of the things that I really enjoy is that law, I think engineering, and I think philosophy all have this rule-based system that has to engage with each other to build towards a kind of common results. And I think in that way that there is this really interesting dynamic between learning from philosophy to inform how we think about code bases, or code bases to think about how we think about legal systems. But it's also just so interesting, I think, to have people of each individual group in the same conversation, and to be able to take a step back and watch how much overlap there is, and how an engineer or a CTO thinks about something, or a CFO or a legal professional thinks about something, and how there's this common frame of reference that we can build within. And then, of course, like execution looks different, right? I mean, a legal brief and a code base are obviously very different things, but it is so interesting how like you can almost pull from like Lockean philosophy to understand how we need to build like a rules-based system for governance of data and AI. And like, don't put me on a pedestal to talk about that for too long, but like, there's some interesting overlaps on that front.
I certainly think back to, I had some philosophy courses I loved in college, and just the pure logic one was the great intersection I found between software development, mathematics, and philosophy. Yeah.
I find that to be my favorite people I enjoy to talk to in the space, of which you are certainly one of them. But it's like a small pocket of us that like this overlap and enjoy talking about it.
And so you went on from law school into basically, I think, government. Essentially, you were a legal intern and then a law clerk for the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, correct?
I was, yeah. When you're in law school, you get tricked into doing these summer gigs that are like more or less super high-end paid labor that is often undercompensated or non-compensated. I worked at a place that was basically like a nonprofit consulting firm for all the state governments, and actually did a lot of work on truth and legal systems that have to do with truth at the state level. And I was able to actually very fortunate to be able to produce some kind of foundational research in that space that's still kind of playing out around us as we think about like truth and campaigning and elections in general. And then I also took a really fun gig doing law clerk at a place that I would eventually come in to do kind of corporate leadership at, which was the U.S. Election Assistance Commission after law school. I was doing all of it at the same time. I was trying to build that company, which like there's a wonderful anecdote in here about like stay focused on one company. Don't try to do two at the same time. But I was young and dumb and, like full of illusions of what was possible in a day. Made it through, built and ran a civil rights organization in the southern part of the United States. We fought Jim Crow laws for years. I had some big wins on that front and actually kind of worked ourselves out of a job in our small niche of that world, and had to find a job again at some points, and ended up coming back into the government, into two very non-traditional government jobs. One, doing corporate leadership and resetting the kind of foundation and corporate governance of a U.S. agency, an independent agency in the federal government. And then one doing the closest thing the federal government has to corporate venture investment for the U.S. Department of Defense. Super fun. And at this point in the story, I've been a lawyer, but stopped doing that. And then also had 2 government jobs, but also stopped doing that. So there's probably some stepping stones of things that aren't perfect for us along the way to hopefully something that is.
Well, certainly as, someone that claims Atlanta as home, where I grew up, I love to tell people that while the South has a lot of growing to do, and the work will likely never be done, when we think about our past and what can be improved, if you want to see a place that has done the hard work towards a better society, the South is not a bad place to look either. Quite proud of the progress. It is a little bit of a both is true. You were at the U.S. Elections Commission during a very interesting time in our national government. I believe you were there during the transition to the Trump administration.
I was, yes. I have worked for the government while 2 different administrations were there. I worked for the U.S. government while Obama was in office, and I worked for the U.S. government while Trump was in office. I think, laughable timing of the job that I took is that I took the job to come in, and my job was basically to reset some fundamentals of the agency and help it really build into its congressional mandated mission in a better and more effective way. The agency is the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, and their mission is mostly the federal component of U.S. election administration at the federal and state levels. I took that job in August of 2016, and I think that U.S. elections, the role of intelligence and the administration of U.S. elections changed more in the next 5 months than it probably had in the 50 years before it. And it was a wild, wild ride. But yeah, was there during the administration of the change between Obama and Trump, which was a big part of those days.
Yeah, and we're certainly, it's a difficult topic to navigate. So I just want to state that up front, having had a lot of dear friends that work for the federal government and went through that transition as well. First off, we're just really grateful for the hard work that they do to keep our government running and believe deeply in democracy as a community. I have to imagine that definition of truth was a moving target on some level during that time. Yeah.
I think that's right. And I'm not sure that has changed a whole lot. Truth is a topic that I think if you ask 3 people on the street what the truth is about a question, you'll get 3 slightly different answers. And I think that we're in a world today where there is advantage to be had from being on the right side of a truth equation for particular audiences. And it was something that was pressed on in a direct and immense way in 2016, 2017, 2018. And it was, I think, the beginning of a change, but we're definitely still living in it.
Yeah. And you worked on a brief to define our elections as critical infrastructure. Yeah.
Yes. Yes, I did. And I think of maybe a small nuance there. A Secretary of Homeland Security, Jay Johnson, who was the holdover secretary, which is the term for the secretary that's the last S1 top cabinet secretary level within the U.S. government that is there from the previous administration. There's a staggered kind of transition, and Jay was the last one. And in one of his final months, he wrote a declaration that we did not have anything to do with at the time. Not that we took anything to do with it, but just like we weren't in the room. And he wrote a declaration that said that U.S. elections infrastructure had always been critical infrastructure all along, but no one had really been talking about it in that way. And what that did was it activated U.S. critical infrastructure authorities, powers, and resourcing for our U.S. election system. It's a really long way to say that the Secretary of Homeland Security put an immense amount of backing behind our elections infrastructure with a stroke of a pen. And then the implementation of that is a series of big policy documents that often end up being very long and boring to people who are not lawyers. But they take the page that's about document that's about a page long and turn it into actionable tech policy and implementation for protecting that infrastructure in the full country. And that's where myself and my colleagues really got to work.
Incredible timing for your background, right? Like I'm really stunned sometimes at the right set of skills, the right group of people at the needed moment coming together. And this seems like one of those, right? Your background as a lawyer, your understanding as an engineer, your ability to bring forward, I think people that work in the federal government, a passion for effective practices really needed, and obviously, no matter where you sit on the issue, at the end of the day, for democracy to survive, we have to provide the infrastructure to facilitate it.
Yeah, I think that that's right. And I think that, without driving us down a whole rabbit hole, we're in a world where gray zone conflict is pretty continuous between large and small nation states. The idea of launching a cyber attack from one nation state onto the other is pretty commonplace. We find it all over the news. This isn't classified information by any means. And it's a world where we have to really think about what it takes to keep us safe and secure on a day-to-day basis. And every country has a different way of talking about this. In the United States, the way that we keep the power lines running, we keep the ports operating, and we keep airports secure, as well as our election system running, is a thing called critical infrastructure. And it's become ever more important of a policy and tech implementation area now than it has ever been in our history, just because of how easy it is to deploy things like cyber and information attacks from one nation to the other.
Yeah. A big part of those attacks are the narratives that go with them. And that's something that you're being deeply innovative in at Pendulum. Let's talk about a harmful narrative in a way. It's something that I think you're really passionate about. It's something that brings it together. How do you think about harmful narratives? And maybe examples are helpful.
Yeah. I really appreciate you calling that out, right? There's I think, misconception that there is a hardline separation between physical, cyber, and information or harmful narratives that are out there. And what we often find is that even within the world of corporate cyber defense, the narrative that comes from a big breach is as damaging as some of the actual breach itself. And in here, as with any sort of large corporate event, the truth of what's going on and the perception of what's going on is the target that everyone wants to focus on after we lock down the systems. It's the same in the government space. I mean, we have cyber attacks that have information campaigns that run on top of them. We can talk about them here in the US, but there was also a really notable one in Albania, in the Balkans about a year ago. It was a more recent example where they launched, one nation state held all of Albania's government resources in ransom for about 2 days, but then just launched this Twitter campaign on top of it, talking about how the government is insecure. And that was by all means the end goal. And we saw the same tactics here in the US in 16, 17, 18, into 19 as well, where there was a pretty constant set of cyber attacks and harmful narratives that came along with them.
Yeah.
It begs big questions though. It begs big questions of how to really engage with this topic in the Western world, where we hold First Amendment rights principle, and they're absolutely critical to us. And at Pendulum, at least, we take the perspective here that we're not here to adjudicate truth. What we are really here to do is help actors, help companies, help governments understand the world around them in a more proactive, more nuanced way, so that they can increase their empathy with key communities around these narratives and be a more helpful, more proactive member of the conversation, so that we don't end up focusing on what specifically is true or what specifically is false, but we don't end up having some sort of globalized truth meter, because that's bad for everybody. What we want to really do is empower more healthful, more proactive, more positive engagement with around the questions of what's true and what's not, and why it's important to the groups that are out there.
Yeah. So much information being produced by so many people. It's almost impossible to synthesize what's happening without a technological tool, because it's enormous. And we've certainly been studying a lot of breaches on Secure Talk. And one of the things that is a thread on almost all of them is there's this time between which they've said, hey, there's a particular breach going on, but then they can't talk about anything because they're in the midst of warfare, right? They're trying to lock systems down. They don't want it to get worse. And sometimes releasing information can allow another attack to happen through to, 9 months later when no one cares anymore. Now they're finally talking about what actually happened. But in the middle, people are making up the stories on their own based upon their best judgment or worst fears.
I think that that's exactly spot on. And I think that you're speaking to a really difficult part of the equation here. That is, while something is ongoing, whether it's a cyber attack or a physical attack, or it's the discovery of new information that's important to your audiences and your buyers about the company, there's a period of time where the company has to operate, understand, and communicate simultaneously. And it's difficult to do because it's a moving equation that follows through it. And everybody wants to immediately, I think, jump to this idea that the truth is going to cure everything. And I think that what we really take a perspective of is that like honesty and empathy are really what will cure everything as it comes through here. However, the word truth presupposes that the way that your audiences will think about the events is the same way that your company thinks about the events. And that's almost never the case.
Yeah. My academic career was in theater, not tech, even though that was my career. But I tell my team all the time, like humans communicate in stories, right? Fundamentally understanding the truth of something, but not being able to communicate a narrative around why that's true, it won't land. You won't get the buy-in. Yeah.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, humans are storytellers. The way we understand and process information is through the lens of stories. It's how we see everything. It's how we understand everything.
Yeah. So when did you found Pendulum?
My co-founder and I founded Pendulum in 2021. We've been at this for about 2.5 years now.
That's excellent. And so, we've been leading up to this a little bit, but tell us a little bit about what Pendulum does.
So Pendulum is here to redefine the world of risk intelligence, and we operate in this modern, hyper-interconnected digital world. It's our mission is to help companies increase the observability of the communities in the world around them and help them have that more proactive, healthy, helpful engagement within communities that are important to them. When you use Pendulum, we want you to be able to turn or understand and then turn risk that you assess from misalignment of values in these narratives that we've been talking about into opportunities for that helpful engagement. And within it, we've got a really powerful piece of technology that is able to look at massive portions of online conversation through public-facing information, important note, only public-facing information, but public-facing information on social media, open web, and other sources that kind of coexist with this. And within that, are able to distill the narratives that are driving the mind space of core communities, understand how those narratives are impacting those communities and changing the mind space of those kind of key buying groups for companies, and then help the company understand how to engage with that risk or opportunity that comes from there. So a real crisp and kind of like easy example is if there's a community that's really important to you and they're starting to have a political affiliation of a type of product that you sell because a narrative is saying, hey, like, let's use an old example so that we're not calling out anybody specifically, but I've certainly driven a Prius in my life, but there's a perception that if you drive a Prius, you're a liberal. If you're a company that has a hyper-conservative group of buyers, and your cars are starting to look like and be perceived like a Prius, this becomes a problem for you. So we help you surface and detect that narrative and understand that impact incredibly early, and then help you have that proactive engagement with it so that you can make sure your company's not far articulated out from it. And we've got this kind of core unit that is narratives and engagement with narratives in a very nuanced way. That is what we discover, surface, and analyze for our users.
One thing that the work that you've done is really intriguing to me in a broader landscape is that cybersecurity, security in general, used to be the work of nation states.
Yes.
But lately it has been blended into our commercial infrastructure, companies and what they do. And we see this on a lot of levels, right? It's about the chips that we're manufacturing. It's about whether or not TikTok is going to be owned by China or owned by the United States. And there's a blending of where security happens. It's not just at the nation state anymore. The nation state has a reliance on the commerce section, the enterprise section of the nation, to having good security, to operating effectively.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. I think we've been very fortunate that people like you have joined the fight. This world of like cyber has moved to the commercial space. And I can tell you, I mean, in the government, we certainly have government exclusive cyber resources. That's a real thing.
Yeah.
But the government is constantly trying to learn from the private sector too. And I think the private sector has become mostly the leader here.
Yeah. The conversations I've had with a couple of retired FBI agents, that their primary goal was, engaging with the businesses around them that were suffering from cyber attacks. Yes.
Yes. The victim notification and like helping something, gosh, I can't remember what they're called. We were the recipients of some of these, even in the government. So we had a cyber breach of our systems back in the day when we were in the government, and we got our own calls from the FBI.
Yes.
Remember the days you want to have.
No, those are not great meetings, are they?
No, we developed a rule, which was if there weren't FBI armed agents in the room on that day, it was a good day.
That's really good. Oh, man. I certainly am, in our work at StrikeGraph, I'm glad that we help organizations kind of meet a security bar. There were many years when I, as the chief technology officer, felt like I was just swimming in the deep end of the pool and wondering if we were doing the right work. And it's very helpful to have certain security standards or compliance outcomes that you're driving towards. And it's not always perfect, right? Like we could argue over what's good or bad, but at least we're doing some activity and that we're sharing some best practices as a community to really get an effective set of outcomes. So, one of the things that's interesting to me is it's one thing to have this threat intelligence that Pendulum provides, to start to learn about what the narratives are happening out there. How would one of your customers or anyone broadly working in the space think about responses? How do you think about constructing a response against an issue?
I think that this is a super interesting question to talk through because it brings us back to something that you flagged earlier in the conversation, which is what is the role that truth is going to play here in the conversation? I think we always recommend our partners are honest in their response. I mean, it's like there is no bigger crime in the world than the cover up. Like it's never a good idea to kind of go down that path. But I think the much more difficult part of the equation is how to find empathy with the groups that care about you as a company and understand how to engage with their value structure in a way that helps you meet them in a place that helps everyone come out of this better than you were in the beginning. And you think about a cyber breach is something that we love to talk about in such a technical way. However, that's not the way our customers ever think about things. What our customers think about is their own personal information potentially being leaked or follow-on attacks that are going to come from them because their like list of contact information is out there, or maybe their banking information. Cyber attacks can feel very, very personal, even when an individual wasn't the target of it. And I think that for us at Pendulum, when we think about this, there's a few key components. One of them is understanding the narratives that exist around the event. It's a basic spot to start, but it's an incredibly important one. And I can tell you that they are not always what you think they're going to be. There are a lot of surprises out there. Two is understanding the groups that are driving those narratives and the impact, and crosswalking that with the impact that we know those groups are going to have on your business. The business has that context. And then three, understanding what is pushing the narrative in each direction that leads to impacts on your company. And this used to be the world that would take us 6 months of qualitative research to try to do. Or at best, if you're working at breakneck speed, deploying tons of resources, 2 to 3 months. And the problem with that is that this is work that has to be done, as you said in the beginning, while we're managing the tactical side of the response, and quickly to make sure we're communicating and engaging with our audiences as they learn about the breach. So that old world of 2 to 3, or like most commonly 6 months of research, is unacceptable. And that's where technology starts to play a role, right? Being able to hit those 3 targets in, for us at Pendulum, in near real time helps inform a human response that meets your community where they are, and helps you have really global sense of awareness for what the risk is to your buyers, the risk is to you, and the perception risk that is either growing or not around that moment.
Yeah. I mean, this seems like a lot of invention, but there's some starting points that are a little apparent to me. One is that the customer base that you have, which is probably who you want to keep and who you want to keep working with, already is bought into some of the values, hopefully, that you brought to the marketplace. And reinforcing what those are and living through a breach or a disaster situation, according to those values. Like, don't let go of your original values.
Yeah.
Hang on to the things that people cared about from the beginning, right? That reinforce that they still matter to you in behavior and communication.
I think that that's right. I often counsel partners or like customers or whomever is in this equation. I often counsel them to use your framework for how you've thought about cyber breaches and how you're going to think about an information attack or a harmful narrative. We know actually inherently how to communicate here. We know how to assess the risk. What we need to be able to do is we need to be able to understand more information, get better and more nuanced insights into it, and then move at the speed that the information is flowing. But we don't need to throw out our books. We don't need to remove the context that we already come in with. We're in fact not really learning new skills. What we're learning how to do is move at that new rate of speed that is required for this. And sure, there's some organizational change that comes along with that. Like there's no development that comes without a little bit of growth. But at the same time, it is always really comforting, I think, with our partners, is that starts to click for them. It's like, oh, I know how to do this.
Yeah.
Yes, you. If you're a CIO out there and you're listening to this, or you're a CTO and you're listening to this, you know exactly what to do in this scenario. You just need the tools to help your teams operate in that way.
Yeah. I can think about an organization that had a breach, and part of the challenge for them was that, first off, the breach happened. They did pretty good about communication, but there was this time when the communication was a little bit of a blame to the customer, where they were like, customers did not create passwords long enough. That exponentially made it easier to hack accounts. But instead of like narrating that way, I think it would have been more powerful to narrate it as, we're adjusting the requirements for password creation, and this is exactly the reason. So we understand that this is an impact to you. You now have to build a bigger password, but the difference is years of time to crack something as opposed to hours.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I think rule number 1 somewhere, or maybe rule 0, should be never blame your customers.
Yes, that's good.
But there's probably like a larger lesson that we can take away in here, which is to say, if we understood our customers' value set, and then we understood the narratives around the event or the way that our customers were perceiving the event, we would have gotten to that conclusion and like 6 companion conclusions that are very important to us at the same time early in the process. It's easy to beat up on people who like take a wrong path from a comm standpoint, but I think it's much more difficult to like lean into kind of how we prevent that in the future. But the great news is we're talking about, like, it's actually a pretty simple framework as long as you got the right tech.
Yeah. To your point, and I think the power of Pendulum as a solution, efficiency super matters here, right? Because there's almost a return on investment. If you wait too long, you climbing a very steep hill. But if you start out early with a communication pattern and something that you're comfortable with and something that can be reinforced by your broader team and your own customers, that's got to pay dividends over time.
That's exactly right. Communicating early is one of the biggest and most deceptively simple sounding tactics that you can do right now. It is the way that information flows right now. The information space is owned by the people who communicate early. And I think the framework that I always encourage people to think in is that regardless of whether or not you are communicating or another big player is communicating, we have to understand that the space, our customers, influencers, or people who just can shape the conversation in general are talking about it. So there is no opportunity to wait and see anymore. And I think the thing that makes it deceptively simple to say, but very difficult to actually take action on, is that part of the framework for a response around a cyber breach is usually a equation about potential impact on the business from this. And there's usually a multitude of factors that go into that, but one of them is a business level impact beyond just the leakage of information that could come out of it. So within this, one of the things that we actually have built within the Pendulum framework is the ability to get to that risk and that impact equation very quickly, so that we're not just helping the communicators, we're also helping the technologists, the information specialists, the security specialists who are doing that equation and then working from a common collaborative environment for the communicators as well. So that's the other last piece of it, which is that we all hate that moment where we do all of that hard work and then we ship it to somebody who has to tell our story for us. And then they use a completely different data set and they tell a different story.
Yeah.
And it's something we love. We love to help on both sides because we get a more cohesive story. And then back to that question of truth and honesty, it's also a more honest and true and consistent story that comes out.
Yeah, absolutely. I think about the future a little bit. I've worked with AI since it was algorithmic programming a long, long time ago. I'm not as blown away by some of the new tools that we see in the marketplace. I think we lagged actually, and the progress is finally catching up a little bit. We're certainly in a space of narrative development, utilizing large language models and generative AI solutions that's going to run a little bit of an arms race. You guys are helping capture something on probably the threat side quite a bit. But how do you think about the other side of the battlefield and the tools that are available?
Yeah. Are you asking me to play offense for a minute?
Let's do it. Yeah. Take us, Mark. What's armchair quarterback for us?
I think so. The framework I look at things in is that the more democratized access to offensive tools become, the higher the threat vector is. Whatever threat landscape we're talking about. This is the same thing that we saw in the cyberspace, right? Like offensive cyber tools became much more readily accessible. And then we got the supply chain question in here where you could just hire an individual for each step of the process. And then in order to orchestrate a nice large scale cyber attack, you actually just needed cryptocurrency and access to the right marketplaces. You didn't actually need to be an offensive engineer by any means whatsoever.
Right.
You could not know how to do any of this, but you could just project plan your way through it. And I think that what we're seeing in the Gen AI space is that those tools, whether they are true cyber offensive tools or they are companions in the information space, are becoming democratized incredibly quickly. And what I think we're in now is I think that we're in the day of day zero information attack risk, where now, much like we moved into a world where our day zero threats in the cyberspace were able to be proliferated throughout the world very quickly, we now have the opportunity to have information injections, whether it's through a deep fake or an offensive attack here, or quite frankly, just a false story that's told very effectively through some Gen AI tools that can scale to the point of massive impact within a singular day where we didn't even know about the existence of it the day before. More than likely we won't, because it's so easy to generate that content. And I think now, if you're thinking offensively, you have to be thinking in the readiness of those tools. You have to be thinking in the redundancy of your supply chain for threat. And then if you start to think about that from inside the castle, you have to start to be able to see the number of threats across the hill starting to exponentially grow. One guy's opinion, but like, that's the way that I see it.
I think that's really powerful. And I love this zero-day information attack. I think that's really valid. There's just too many porous systems that are algorithmically driven by outrage interaction that easily and just in massive, like a virus infection, right, can really infect the information space quickly. Speaking of situations like that, we always love to bring forward an issue or a breach. We have one that I think speaks to your background a little bit.
Okay.
So I'm going to review the incident a little bit, and then we can talk about it some if that sounds good. So on January 5th, Kari Saarinen, the co-founder of Linear, posted via LinkedIn that a representative from Carta had reached out to an existing investor in Linear, his company. He stated that Carta had been relating details of a financing transaction and had attempted to elicit interest in selling their shares in a secondary transaction. Kari related in his LinkedIn post that Carta was attempting to sell Linear shares to non-disclosed buyers, and he likened it to the end of Carta as a trusted platform. So here we have, I think to your point, almost a zero-day information issue. The data that was included in the discussion, this is where we see the data breach. One was that Linear was engaged in a private transaction. And as you and I both know, these are typically held very closely until we announce them. The value of the transaction, the relative costs of participating in buying shares of the company, and misrepresenting Carta's agreement to facilitate the transaction of shares on a secondary basis. Now, Carta has been public about their plans to develop secondary markets for liquidity transactions called Carta X. However, Carta X is supposed to be a wholly different business unit. And Connie Loizos on January 7th, 2024, stated in a TechCrunch article about Carta's master subscription agreement, the language is noticeably vague about the protection of customer data. So now let's talk a little bit about the response from Carta. So Carta CEO Henry Ward immediately joined the conversation on LinkedIn to apologize. And in a subsequent email, Henry related that the incident had been caused by an employee who violated internal procedures by reaching out to customers they shouldn't have. However, subsequent reporting shows that multiple companies and multiple investors have experienced similar data breaches. The breach is still ongoing. And so let's think here a little bit about, we have a security issue, a data breach in a way. It's become a reputational harm issue and attempted response.
Yeah. It's such an interesting example, isn't it?
Yeah. It's a microcosm community in a way, but that community is really sensitive about this type of information. And a lot of us use Carta. A lot of us do.
Yeah. I think there's a through line here and a lot of the other conversation we've been having, though, and that is that when we think about breaches and being able to apply previous frameworks we've had around cyber defense or breaches into the new world that we live in here in 2024, there's a lot of our framework from the past that has to be applied here in the future or the present, really. And one of the big components of this that stands out to me is that when we think about cyber defense, humans are often the weakest link in any of our chains. We can look at any of the notable breaches from the last kind of 5 or 6 or 10 years. It's a huge portion of it is human engineering or humans going outside of policies. And I think that now, today, that still continues to be true. According to the Carta CEO, it was a human, an employee working outside of the policies that they had set. I'm not incredibly familiar with the specific policies, so I can't opine on that. But what I can say is that we see that pattern start to flow through. I think what we have also seen change, though, is the style of and the reporting surface area has changed shape and has grown in such an immense way. And I think if you look at that from the Carta example, it's pretty clear. There was a business transaction that was going on or attempting to go on, and an individual who was a part of that, who was outside of the company, reported the bad action on a public-facing platform. Those platforms are now one of your company's largest surface areas for conversation around what you're doing right and what you're doing wrong, and even on an an incredibly small level. And because those platforms are so good at creating communities and spreading information, now an individual can spread a narrative and push a narrative around your company incredibly quickly. And we saw how fast that moved with Carta.
Yeah.
Right? Like the CEO becoming involved in that conversation live is representative of how fast that started to move. And now, as we think about companies, we have to start to think about how companies can understand how to engage with that style of risk when they're not 10 people sitting next to each other, but they're thousands of people in different geographic areas who have the ability to change the entire perception of their company through an individual action in a way that there is no corporate governance structure that will ever slow them down. And I think that's the world we live in right now.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And when it comes down to those people, especially in this particular situation, I firmly believe that the engineering goes both ways, right? You can either allow someone to be motivated by a sales outcome, which we do. We compensate our go-to-market teams on performance, and they will want to win. We're driving them to want to win. And if you give them access to data that will help them to win, but you didn't want them to use it, I just don't think that's a good decision. This is easy to say, hey, if we're going to motivate this person this way, we do need to put guardrails around them in a way so that they can behave according to what we would expect in our policy. Yeah.
I'll steal something from somebody who is far smarter than me and much further along in their career than I am. But their phrase is that the best defense to a reputational hit is good internal governance.
That is brilliant. That I don't know that we can do any better in this particular episode of the podcast, Mark. What an enjoyable conversation. What a unique and emerging space for us to be aware of as leaders and citizens in the community. I really appreciate the work you do at Pendulum, and I'm very grateful for joining our podcast today, Mark.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. And I'm equally as grateful for the work you're doing at StrikeCraft. This has been an absolutely amazing conversation. Thanks for having me so much.
Excellent.